for 101. We will go back on the record. Dr. Schmidt, just a quick reminder, you are under testimony. Make sure your green light's on. Feel free to move that microphone wherever you'd like to be comfortable, as long as we can hear you. So, thank you. I believe, Mr. Taylor, you're first.
Thank you. I'm Wally Taylor. I represent the Sierra Club. It's my understanding from your written testimony you work for EXP Energy?
Correct.
And from their website, I gathered that your company works for companies developing energy projects?
Among other things, yes.
Okay. What are the things?
Oh, they do hospital design, architecture, they do entertainment centers, it's over 3,500 people, so it's a big firm.
Okay. But as far as your part of the firm, so to speak, the environmental impacts, you work for energy projects, basically?
Correct.
Okay. Has your portion of EXP ever worked for an environmental organization or a citizens group wanting to protect the environment?
In my 36 years, I've done some work for the Conservation Fund, Audubon. Just depends on the projects and where they are.
Is that a very small part of your work, though?
Not many.
Yeah. On page 3 of your direct testimony, can we bring that up, please? Line 10. You say there that Summit performed desktop and field surveys for a multitude of environmental media. Did Summit do it, or did your firm do it?
It's a combination of third parties and Summit.
Okay. What are the third parties with it?
Oh, it's a host of firms. West Tech Environmental, Mergent, Perennial. I can't remember all of them, but there are different firms for.
Auditory or tech difficulty. Looks like we're good again. Go ahead. Sorry, why don't you go ahead and repeat your question, Mr. Taylor?
Did you supervise those other firms?
So my role for Summit was environmental project management. So our company helped Summit, particularly in the early stages before they had a lot of staff, to help manage the environmental component of the project. So they may not have been contractually working for me, but we helped organize and schedule.
And would you describe what was done in those desktop surveys, first of all?
Well, initially, about 2 years ago, we reached out to the regulators, Fish and Wildlife, Corps of Engineers, IDNR. They provided us with some guidance. We did some desktop work with aerial photography, NWIs, NHD, soil surveys to try and identify habitats or areas that they asked us to look for. And then in the field, we actually went out and walked and looked for and confirmed.
Yeah. I hadn't gotten to the field surveys yet, but that's okay. When you say you walked out into the areas, how big a job was it? I mean, this is quite a massive project. Did you walk every inch of the pipeline route?
Yeah, we created a 300-foot survey corridor, and teams walked the route. Basically, we did 100% cultural resource. So we surveyed for cultural resources over 100% where we had access. Same thing with wetlands, water bodies, listed species.
And how long did that take you?
It's still going on.
So we don't have a final survey report yet?
We've created survey reports by year that we submitted to the agencies. So the 2022 surveys were submitted to IDNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Corps. SHPO's received reports, and then 23 survey reports will be completed this fall and submitted.
Okay. For the record, SHPO is SHPO for State Historical Preservation Office. And would Summit have those reports?
Yes.
I wondered because when I asked for environmental reports from Summit, they said they didn't have any.
You have to ask the council. I
will. You said in your testimony at page 2, very bottom, line 22, that you oversaw and participated in the preparation of Exhibit H to the, Exhibit F to the petition. When you say you oversaw and participated in the preparation of Exhibit F, what do you mean?
Our company put together Exhibit F, but it was a multidisciplinary effort. So there were others who wrote sections of it.
Well, let's look at Exhibit F, if we can pull that up. At the bottom of the second paragraph, on 1.0, it says the project is necessary for these ethanol plants because it provides a CO2 transportation solution which otherwise would not exist, and without which Iowa's ethanol plants would be at a significant long-term disadvantage to ethanol plants in states like North Dakota and Illinois, which contain proven subsurface geologic storage formation. Was it part of your scope of work to make a sales pitch for Summit?
No, I didn't write this section. Summit wrote section 1.
But you said you oversaw and were responsible for the preparation of Exhibit F, correct?
Yeah, we helped make sure everybody stayed on schedule, provided their sections when they were needed. We put the document together and provided it to council for filing.
Go to Table 1. I don't think there's a page number on it. Scroll down. That looks like Table 1. It's labeled, I think, land uses by county. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But that doesn't tell us where the environmental sensitive areas are, does it?
This is just the land use summary table that's required for Appendix F. So that was created and included.
In section 2.1 of, you have to scroll back up, you state that there will be no significant post-construction impacts to land use. What did you go by to make that conclusion?
Well, over 95% of the route is agricultural production. So either crop or hay or grassland. And with the AMIP as stated in that paragraph, the measures that the state requires pipelines to use in construction. Those best management practices result in no significant impact post-construction.
Are you an agronomist?
No, sir.
Yeah. So, is it fair to say you just went by Summit's statement that they would restore the land as it was before?
Not just Summit's statement on their commitment, but the AMIP is based on best management practices. And those practices have been developed through numerous pipeline projects throughout the U.S. In fact, a lot of the components in there are based on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's plans and procedures, which are proven measures to restore and protect land.
But the AIMP here is just Iowa focused,
Specific.
is it not?
Correct.
Section 2.4 there's a table 3, if we can find that. It says public lands crossed by the project construction footprint. Are those indeed all of the public lands?
At the time this was filed, yes.
Has that changed?
I don't recall. I do know that we avoid all IDNR lands and rivers through HDD or some other bore method. And some of these may have been addressed as well.
Well, DNR has what they call sovereign lands, don't they?
Correct.
And what specifically are the sovereign lands that this pipeline would cross?
There's 4 rivers and 2 state lands, one of which is a park. I can't remember the name. They're all avoided by HDD. I know that. So we've worked that out with IDNR. We showed them the crossing plans, and they've accepted those.
Are you going to horizontally direction the drill under the lands that are not rivers or streams?
I'm not sure your question.
Okay. You said that there were some public lands and some, I think you said 4 rivers or streams.
Correct.
And then, 2 or 3 public lands? Are you going to horizontally direction drill under those public lands?
Correct.
And do you know what those are off the bat?
I'd have to look.
Would they be on this table? You can see it.
And most of those are scenic byways. There is one state park there, Brushy Creek State Park. That's an HDD. And there's another park up there near the top that's also a bore.
When you, not you, but when a pipeline company horizontally directional drills under a public land like this or under a river, they have to start the bore quite a ways back, don't they, in order to be able to bore deep enough to go under a river, for example?
Yes, the distance setback is based on the depth of the drill.
And if it's a river, for example, and there's a large wooded area on either side of the river, which is not uncommon, correct?
Not as much here as they used to be, but yeah.
And so a lot of that, the forested area would have to be cut down in order to start the directional drill, correct?
Not necessarily.
Why not?
Just depends on how wide that forested area is and where the drill starts and ends.
Well, yes, but if the bore has to start in the wooded area, that's going to take some trees out, correct?
Only if it's designed that way. We tried to avoid wooded areas. IDNR gave us a lot of guidance, and we did a good job at avoiding forested areas. I think out of the thousands of acres, we have about 30 acres of wooded area on the whole project. So it's less than 0.1%.
And defining section 3.0 of Exhibit F, it talks about alternative routes, but doesn't really describe any alternative routes. Did you supervise or have any input in considering those alternative routes?
No, it was done before my firm was hired, all that work.
Do you know who would have been supervising the consideration of the alternative routes in terms of the environmental impacts?
There was a data request that came after this filing, and a table was provided of all the GIS layers that were used in the routing exercises before my time, but that had all the environmental constraints in there. I don't know who would have oversaw that.
And the GIS is what you call a desktop survey,
Correct.
right?
Based on agency and publicly provided data.
So it would not have been a field survey like you've described.
No, you don't typically survey major alternatives. In 36 years, I think I've done 2 projects where we surveyed one alternative. Agencies don't require you to survey those.
Well, they may not require it, but isn't it a good idea?
Not necessarily. The desktop data is very good to help you with the routing decisions.
But if you don't do the field surveys, how do you know whether that route is really going to impact environmental resources?
Well, there's a lot of data layers that exist within environmental resources: listed species habitat, listed species locations, cultural resource sites, wetlands, water bodies, native prairies. It's come quite a ways since I first started in this business when it was all paper.
So why do you do the field surveys then if you have all this other information?
For permitting.
Just because the permit agencies require it?
We have to do confirmation surveys based on the desktop analysis, yes.
Well, if your field surveys would reveal that there's a protected species or some critical wetland or whatever in the chosen route, you don't change the route at that point, do you?
Yeah, we do. We did quite a few HDDs and bores and route adjustments for cultural sites, tribal sites. We had tribal interests that participated in our surveys. They identified sites important to them. We avoided all those. So yeah, we do make those changes.
How significant were some of the route changes? The reason I ask is we've heard testimony from some summit witnesses that they might do a micro change, I think is what they called it, but they would not really change the route. So what would they do if there really was a cultural resource that required a major reroute?
Objection. State your objection.
that question mischaracterizes the record. It greatly oversimplifies a breadth of testimony about different changes at different points in the development of the route, and to simply say that some witnesses have said that only micro reroutes have been made or are feasible, I think mischaracterizes the breadth of the testimony.
I think the record speaks for itself that they have said that numerous times, and this witness has said that if there were some environmental or cultural resource that were found, they would reroute it. And I want to know, how significant the reroute would have been, because we've heard evidence that a significant reroute wouldn't be done.
Can you rephrase your question to get to the point you're trying to make, Mr. Taylor?
If the field survey revealed a significant cultural resource or a significant environmental issue, would or has the pipeline route been modified beyond the chosen corridor, the chosen easement?
I can't relate it to the easement. We do surveys on a 300-foot corridor, so it doesn't equate to the easement.
Okay.
And I can tell you, up to this point, we've surveyed in the high 90 percentiles for cultural resource and biological resources. And up to this point, we've avoided sites. Most of those reroutes are on the same property owner.
Okay. So there hasn't been a reroute that would require going outside that 300-foot corridor?
There may have been some early on, but I can't recall.
You said you did desktop and field surveys for protected species?
Correct.
Was this in general, or was it pursuant to the Corps of Engineers nationwide 58 permit?
It was for ESA consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and IDNR consultation for state-listed species.
I guess my question is, did you consult with Fish and Wildlife Service generally, or just in connection with the Corps of Engineers permitting?
No, for the whole project.
Can we bring up Sierra Club Hearing Exhibit 1? Yeah. Is the western prairie fringed orchid a protected species?
Yes.
And this exhibit purports to show its range in Iowa. Does that look accurate to you as far as the range?
That's the historic range, but that's not the data that Fish and Wildlife uses for consultation.
By historic range, what do you mean?
Well, historically, the species was much more widespread than it is today. So when you consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service, you start what's called an IPAC consultation, and you send them the KMZ files, and they'll tell you which species have to be surveyed and where.
And so, are you saying that none of the Summit pipeline was in or through the range of the Western Prairie Plains Northern?
I don't know what those yellow lines are because that's not Summit's system. There's a lot of lines there that don't connect. Some of them don't look familiar.
Can you bring up Sierra Club Hearing Exhibit 2? Is the tricolored bat a protected species?
It is now.
And do you agree that this is, that the purple area shows the range for the bat?
Historic range. Yep.
And by historic range, exactly what do you mean?
The species isn't found in every pixel of that purple area. It's found in specific habitat within that range.
But certainly it would be something that you'd want to survey for, correct?
Oh yeah, we were given a full list of species. Yep.
And certainly the tricolored bat does have habitat within the area of the pipeline route, correct?
Some.
Let's bring up Sierra Club Hearing Exhibit 3. Is the prairie bush clover a protected species?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was one of the ones we surveyed for.
Okay. And again, is there habitat for the clover in the area of the Summit pipeline route?
The historic range covers the pipeline route. There's very little optimal habitat along the route.
Let's go to Sierra Club Hearing Exhibit 4. The Topeka shiner is a fish, correct?
Correct.
And this shows the range. And is it your contention that's the historic range again?
Yes, that's what it looks like to me. It doesn't match the information Fish and Wildlife gave us on where we had to focus our work.
Let's bring up a Sierra Club Hearing Exhibit 8. Again, this is for the Topeka shiner. Does the purple line indicate a watershed, so to speak?
Well, it looks like a tracing of a river system, yes.
Yeah. And is that a critical habitat for the Topeka shiner?
I can't tell the name of that stream, but we are boring or HDDing all of the habitat. And Fish and Wildlife has agreed to that conservation measure.
Let's go to the Sierra Club Exhibit 5. Is the northern long-eared bat a protected species?
Yes.
And does it have habitat along the pipeline route?
Yeah, there's some isolated woodland areas that are found along the route that could be potential habitat.
Yeah. And so what is done to protect that habitat?
Protect the habitat?
Yeah.
Fish and Wildlife allows us to remove the habitat out of pup season. So their conservation measures are to remove the trees during the winter and not during pup season.
Yeah. And so in other words, the construction would have to occur in the winter?
tree removal would have to occur in the winter.
Do you control when the construction is done?
That's not my responsibility.
Let's go to Exhibit 7. And this is the Indiana bat. Again, did you find habitat for the Indiana bat along the pipeline route?
So it was all the bats were done at the same time. So,
and again, what's required is that the nesting trees are only allowed to be removed during the winter, correct?
Correct.
But doesn't that actually reduce the habitat for both of those kinds of bats? Because the trees aren't there when they come back to nest again, right?
Sure. But if you look at the scale of these range maps, the number of trees being removed, as I indicated, is tens of acres compared to the thousands that have been removed for whatever other purposes in these states. So the Corps and the Fish and Wildlife look at the context of the impact, not just the absolute impact.
Well, because a lot of trees have been removed in the past, it doesn't say that was the right thing to do at that time, correct?
Probably not. It still occurs today.
Let's look at Sierra Club Hearing Exhibit 6. Is the piping plover a protected species?
Yes.
And is there any habitat for the piping plover that intersects with the pipeline route?
No.
So you're saying this historic habitat, as you call it, is all gone?
That's what Fish and Wildlife told us. They said the nearest nesting area is 20 miles west of us.
And then let's go to Hearing Exhibit 9. This is for the eastern Massagoa rattlesnake. Is the habitat for that species impacted by the pipeline?
No.
Why not?
Fish and Wildlife said there was no suitable habitat. I don't know what those yellow lines are. I don't think they represent the pipeline. So, but I do have correspondence from the Fish and Wildlife saying we don't have to survey for them because it's outside their range.
I will offer Sierra Club Hearing Exhibits 1 through 9. Objection, Your Honor.
Second objection.
Foundation and relevance, but mainly just because it's been brought up several times and Mr. Taylor hasn't clarified what all of those yellow lines are. Some of those may be this project, but a lot of them are not. And for example, the piping plover, almost everything that was covered by what was shown was actually in Nebraska and was not jurisdictional to this board's decision. So without some additional explanation, I just want to lodge the objection to the nature of the material until we can get a little more information.
Mr. Taylor, can you explain what the yellow lines are?
I thought they were the pipeline route. You can see it goes across the main line and comes down to Story County and goes up into Minnesota in that one little finger. That's exactly the route, it seems to me.
I can guarantee you, and I think the board is well aware of this from the maps in its own possession, no part of this pipeline runs from the Cedar Rapids, Iowa City area up towards Dubuque, there is no portion of this pipeline that starts between Mason City and the endpoint shown to the east and runs in sort of a hook-shaped direction down inside that sort of H-shaped cluster there. Those are not part of this pipeline.
Oh, okay. Mr. Taylor, do you have?
Well, this witness has testified about what is or is not in the pipeline route using these maps.
Oh, okay. What were the numbers again, Mr. Taylor?
1 through 9.
Okay. The board will admit Sierra Club hearing exhibits 1 through 9 and give them the weight to.
Are you familiar with Iowa's Wildlife Action Plan?
I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with Iowa's Wildlife Action Plan?
I've heard of it.
Okay. And did you consult with DNR about areas that they feel should be preserved or at least reviewed for species protection and preservation of natural areas?
Yes, so our initial consultation was for them to conduct an environmental review, which included all of that. And they have not provided us with any of those areas.
What areas?
On that map that was part of your exhibit you filed, I think Friday.
Yeah. Do you deny that those are areas that the DNR thinks are at least worth observing and in need of more investigation before there's any development?
I can't speak for IDNR.
Did Fish and Wildlife give you any documents supporting what you've been testifying about as to what they told you about the impacted habitats?
Well, they gave us correspondence on species lists and approvals of survey protocols and things of that nature, yes.
But those weren't filed with your testimony?
No.
Are you familiar with Summit's environmental construction plan?
Yes.
Did you have a hand in preparing that?
We helped put the document together, but not all the sections were written by us.
Can we bring up Farm Bureau Hearing Exhibit 5? And exhibit page 3. It's the upper right-hand corner. There we go. Does that look like the environmental construction plan?
Yes.
Let's go to exhibit page 9. under 1.1, and it talks about an environmental inspector. As I understand it, that environmental inspector would be employed by Summit, correct?
That's for Summit to decide. I don't hire them.
Well, it says SCS, that's Summit, will employ at least one environmental inspector.
Yes, but that's not my responsibility.
So you have nothing to do with the environmental inspector?
Not at this time, no. There's no construction plan. There's no hiring of inspectors. We're a ways away from that.
At some point, if there is an environmental inspector, would you be overseeing that person, or at least in consultation with that person?
It's up to Summit to decide.
Well, I think you said you were still doing some environmental surveys. Is that correct?
Not at the moment, but we have been up to the summer, yes.
And so are you done with all the environmental surveys and studies?
If we have tracks that we are still looking for access, we'll complete those as we get access.
Well, if you don't know, you can tell me, but what do you envision the environmental inspector would actually do?
Well, normally environmental inspectors monitor construction for compliance with permit conditions. Environmental permit conditions.
Let's go to exhibit page 15. Section 2.12, cultural resources. In the first paragraph, it says culturally or historically important areas will be avoided to the extent practical. What does that mean, to the extent practical, in your mind?
Well, at the present time, we avoid all eligible sites. So this is generic language written, before the surveys were completed.
But would you agree there is some, I'll call it wiggle room there, that if someone were to say, well, it's just not practical, so we'll go over the cultural resources anyway? Objection. State the objection.
Asked and answered. The witness already said that we have completely avoided those places, so the suggestion of wiggle room is, after that answer, irrelevant.
Mr. Taylor?
He said at this point, if I recall his answer correctly. So I'm asking, what if in the future, as they're doing construction, for example, they come across some cultural resources?
Okay. Let's try to narrow our questions to new topics. He may answer this question, but let's try to not tread where we've already been.
We surveyed over 97% of the route for cultural resources. We avoid all eligible sites. If during construction a site is found, as described there's an unanticipated discovery plan. We just can't go through sites. That's not how the law is written.
Did you have input in using that language, to the extent practical?
I don't recall.
In the next paragraph, it talks about an unanticipated discovery plan. And then that the construction workers will be trained to, I guess, recognize an unanticipated discovery of a cultural resource. What kind of training is that?
Typically, it's done by an archaeologist, and they have lots of pictures, and they create cards for them on what to look for.
But even if there's some training, do you think the construction workers are really going to be able to recognize something when archaeologists sometimes have trouble?
I've seen it done before in construction of other projects where this has worked very successfully.
Give me some examples where it's worked successfully.
Missouri on Keystone Main Line, there were buried remains found. The UDP was implemented, construction avoided the area. First thing is the sheriff's called, make sure it's not a murder scene. Once he clears it, then the archaeologists come in and the tribal representatives, they do their excavation. In this case, there was a tribal ceremony, and the graves were relocated into another area with the landowner's consent.
In that case, where there are Native American burial sites, first of all, there's a special law on that, isn't there?
Yes, AGPRO.
And do you call in Native American representatives to examine that and approve of moving the bones?
That's part of 106 consultation.
But 106 consultation just means it's consultation. It doesn't really require much, does it?
Oh, it requires quite a bit.
And so are you saying that Native Americans will allow those bones to be moved?
It's a case-by-case situation. I've seen it happen in Louisiana, I've seen it happen in other states, and I've seen it where they wouldn't allow it and the pipeline had to be moved. So, it depends on the situation.
Let's go to page 20 of Exhibit 5. On wetlands, 5.0. It says wetland delineations will occur before construction. What delineation guidance would be used?
U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with the Midwest Regional Supplement.
Okay. Is that the 1987 guidance?
Correct.
Okay. I wonder because, you know, it's been a bone of contention for the past several years. Is that right?
It's gone back and forth a few times, but we entered this project assuming all water bodies and wetlands were core jurisdictional. We did not make a jurisdictional determination. We mapped them all and let the Corps decide.
On page 21, section 5.3.2, it talks about a dry crossing of a wetland. Can you explain exactly how that's done?
Depending on the year and rainfall, there's a lot of what we call upland wetlands that are perched up high on the topography, so at the headwaters of some ephemeral streams. They'll be completely dry. The soil will be dry. And the Corps lets us use a modified method to cross those.
So is that basically an open trench?
Correct.
Would that be like a fen, for example?
Fens are special situations. They're not. They'd have some kind of carbonate rock probably associated with them, so that'd be a different story.
You've mentioned the Corps of Engineers. And for the record, is it correct that the Corps is acting pursuant to Nationwide Permit 58 in this case?
That's what they've indicated, yes.
For the record, can you explain what Nationwide Permit 58 is and what the Corps' process is regarding that?
Well, the Corps of Engineers regulates waters of the U.S. They issue either an individual permit or a nationwide permit. And the nationwide permit program was developed because over the decades of their regulation, they realized there were a lot of activities that were repetitive and also minor in impact. And so they created 60 some odd nationwide permits specific to discrete activities that they deem to be minor in their extent of impact. So 58 is for pipelines that are not oil and gas. Those are nationwide permit 12.
And what a pipeline company would do is submit what's called a pre-construction notice, correct?
Correct.
And the Corps of Engineers reviews that and in consultation with other agencies either issues a verification or not, correct?
Correct.
One of the conditions of a permit 58 involves endangered species, correct?
Yes.
Okay. We've talked about that a little bit, but I want to talk about it maybe more in connection with the Corps. I'll call it permitting, but they're not really permits. Do you have any special consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service regarding the nationwide permit 58?
Objection. State your objection.
Relevance, Your Honor. We've let this go quite a bit, and obviously if the board wants to hear it, the board can certainly overrule and hear it. But an awful lot of the questioning of this witness has been about things that are in IDNR jurisdiction. We're in a line of questioning now that it's about the nationwide permit process. Obviously, this board is not the authority for the federal nationwide permit process. It doesn't have a extensive role with IDNR. A lot of these things are, questions specific to the jurisdiction and the ambit of an unrelated agency, which is where that particular subject matter lies. Just in the interest of moving things along, I don't know how much time we want to spend before this body talking about what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers does as part of its decision making.
Well, they presented the evidence with this witness, and he's mentioned the Corps of Engineers, he's mentioned DNR, and certainly given the balancing test that the Supreme Court of Iowa has given to this board to undertake, I think it's appropriate to ask about these environmental issues. That's one of the issues that the board needs to consider, and in fact, it did in the Dakota Access case.
And, you know, to the extent that there's been a lot of mentions of these, many of those mentions have been either at a general level, you know, here's how we complied with something else we were required to comply with, or have been in response to questions from Mr. Taylor. There is a balancing test, but I don't know that that means that this board could choose to say, you know, we don't think the U.S. Army Corps did its job, or we don't think IDNR did its job, and so we're going to hold that in some adverse way in the balance. There's a division of labor here, and I think that it ought to be observed, at least for the most part.
Okay, thank you. I think we've provided pretty wide latitude, and we will continue to. But if we can try to narrow our questioning down and make our points, please.
So has the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a biological opinion?
Biological opinion comes after a biological assessment.
Okay. Have they done the biological assessment yet?
No.
Okay. So is it fair to say you have a ways to go yet in getting the verification from the Corps?
Ways to go is a broad term.
I
I don't think so. I mean, it could be as soon as the end of this year, early next year.
Okay. I think that's all the questions I have.
Thank you. Mr. Meyer, I have you next.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Good.
Mr. Taylor covered a lot of ground. I'm going to try to plow some new earth here. Looking at your direct testimony on page 3, your answer at line 4 says Summit Pipeline Project is subject to a number of state and federal regulations. Is your testimony to mean that that's at the exclusion of any other sort of statute or code or local regulation?
Not sure the question. This is just an overview of what's applicable, and then there's a table that lists all the permits that are required. So I'm not sure your question, sorry.
Well, so is your testimony then, what state permits would be required?
Well, IDNR, if you look at the table in the section Exhibit F,
is your testimony then that they don't need, as long as they get those permits, they don't need even a permit from this board?
No.
Okay.
No. These are environmental permits above and beyond what the board has to do.
And maybe I asked it in a kind of an awkward way, but that was the purpose of my question was, you're just talking about environmental permitting, right?
Correct.
Okay.
That's what it says there, environmental permits and reviews.
You're not saying that Summit is not subject to other code sections of the Iowa Code?
No.
All right. And does any of your work involve addressing the requirements under Chapter 331 of the Iowa Code?
Not me, no.
How about Chapter 335?
Not familiar.
468?
Not familiar.
Okay, fair enough. On page 7 of your direct testimony at line 12, the question was, will the pipeline interfere with water body drainage patterns along the route? And your answer is no. Does that include, when you talk about water body drainage patterns, does that include open drainage ditches and public road use right-of-ways? The ditches you see along the county road?
Any conveyance.
Okay. Does the DNR regulate that?
Not bar ditches, but they would regulate in floodplains. So
Okay.
major rivers, they have a permit specific to that, which we talked to them about. They're a reviewing body to the Corps of Engineers permit under 401 water quality certificate.
I'm
So,
just
yeah,
I'm just trying to get really down to
Yeah.
the real granular kind of level here. Do the federal regulations address road right-of-ways on secondary roads in the county, the drainage?
it'd have to be connected to a water of the U.S. to be considered jurisdictional, but no, typically not.
Okay. So, when you say no in your answer, is that assuming that there will be local county engineers that would make sure that the drainage
Correct.
is going to flow properly in areas that aren't maybe under the jurisdiction of state or federal regulatory bodies?
Correct. There'd be what I call non-environmental permits from counties and other municipalities. So whatever requirements they have would be separate from this discussion.
And in other projects, those have been required. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Thousands of road crossings and bar ditch crossings and road access. And, yes, lots.
Okay. On page 9 of your direct testimony at number 17, the question, what are the expected impacts to wildlife? And then there's a second part, and what mitigation measures will be adopted? And I'm just focusing on Hardin County. I represent Hardin County supervisors, okay, so it's a very specific target here. This proposed pipeline is going to go under the Iowa River, through the South Fork River watershed area, and other streams, creeks. A lot of those are zoned what we call the green belt, conservation zoning, and wondered what your answer in your direct testimony doesn't really address the second part of the question, what mitigation measures will be adopted. So I wonder if you could give the board some idea of what recommendations you would have that those that are interested in Hardin County would understand that there's going to be something done to mitigate the impact.
Yeah, so a lot of the major rivers and those with either species or cultural resources associated with a stream, a lot of those are bored and drilled, so there wouldn't be a superficial impact. So mitigation is through the construction by avoiding the feature itself. Post-construction, there would be working with NRCS or other, besides the landowners, NRCS and other agencies to make sure the right seed mixes are used, if it's grassland or pasture land. If it's cropland, the landowner dictates, what he's going to do with that property. Obviously, it's going back into production. But any place that is not in active agricultural production, we'll work with the landowners and NRCS to restore it to pre-construction condition. So that would include monitoring after the seeding is done, weed control. We provided a weed plan, so they'd be actively managing and making sure that they didn't introduce something into the area.
So what about deer population? There's a lot of wooded areas that border
Sure.
these waterways, and a very active hunting community in Hardin County.
Yeah.
How will this project, have there been studies to show how that's going to affect deer patterns? If they're going to do it after harvest, it's going to be the rut, it's going to be the mating season, it's going to be the season where they're having fawns. What have studies been done for that?
Not on this project, but in most projects I've worked on, they're built usually during the summer, so the restoration's occurring in the fall. So we wouldn't impede or conflict with the use of that land if it's for hunting. If there's specific restoration a landowner wants along a stream or river, we would entertain that as long as it didn't impede on the operational monitoring of the project.
Has Summit obtained any necessary environmental permits yet?
We did get clearance from the Corps of Engineers under Section 408, which is their civil works program. They determined we didn't have any at the crossing of the Missouri River. That's the only one I'm aware of.
All right. So as far as Hardin County, there's not been any permitting.
No, we've submitted applications for, with IDNR, but nothing's been issued yet.
All right. And is there for the studies that are put together to support those applications, is there a shelf life for those studies before they'd have to be renewed or updated?
Well, listed species surveys, it depends on the species. You usually have to go back every year anyway until construction. So, for instance, raptors, we have to survey for those every year.
That would include eagles?
Eagles and any other type of raptors, but they don't nest in the same spot every year. So you usually go back every year of construction, before construction, to make sure you know where all the nests are. So in that regard, we made commitments to continue those surveys up through construction. But as far as shelf life, I'm not sure. I think usually when you get a permit, they'll have a time span before which, if you don't go to construction, the permit's void. You have to reapply.
I'm not a raptor specialist, and I don't know that you are, but are you saying that you don't think eagles?
Eagles do, but there's a lot of other raptors, and even eagles will move. It depends on what's happening in the area. But I have seen them move nests.
Happening could mean what? Man's activity?
Yeah.
Right. I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gruenhagen.
Got to turn.
You've been watching. Good afternoon, Mr. Schmidt. My name is Chris Gruenhagen, and I'm representing the Iowa Farm Bureau Federation in these proceedings. And I just have a few additional questions for you. In your direct testimony, you describe on page 4, line 15, you describe the characteristics of the Des Moines landform region. Do you recall that?
Yeah, it's very high level summary. Yeah.
Can you describe the general location of the Des Moines lobe as it relates to the route of the pipeline?
We go through the heart of it. They show a map, but it's kind of in the center of the state where we go through it. I don't have a map with me, so.
So we like the main trunk line
Right.
of the pipeline.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the Des Moines lobe.
Yeah.
And in your description of the Des Moines lobe, you use the words marshes and prairie potholes. Can those also be described as wetlands?
Yes.
And does the Des Moines lobe generally have a higher incidence of wetlands than other landform regions?
In a very high level description, yes. Yeah.
And then on page 12, line 1 of your direct testimony, you reference the number of acres of each type of wetland.
Yes.
Just for clarification, can you identify which type of wetland a marsh would be?
TEM or emergent wetland.
And then what type of wetland would a prairie pothole be?
Same thing, emergent wetland.
And then what type of wetland is a fen?
Shrub or an emergent wetland, or it could be forested. Depends on what's around it. How long it's been undisturbed. I've seen some with woods around them, but typically it's PEM and PSS, scrub shrub.
Did Summit or in your contract with them, did you identify any fen wetlands along the route?
I don't recall us finding anything specifically called out as fen, but we did find quite a few isolated emergent wetlands. And I'm not sure. I'd have to go in and look to see if they characterized them or called them as fens or not.
If we could pull up Iowa Farm Bureau Federation Hearing Exhibit 5 that Mr. Taylor was discussing. And if we could go to page 20 of the hearing exhibit. and then section 5.0, wetlands. Can you read that, the first sentence there?
Wetland delineations
Yes.
will occur before construction and captured with GPS for mapping on the construction alignment drawings.
And so has that already occurred?
We've done most, over 90%.
Okay. Can you please describe the process used for identifying wetlands along the route?
So we follow, as I indicated earlier, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual, 1987, and then we use the Midwest Regional Update, which is specific to these states. So it covers things like farmed wetlands and atypical situations in farmland. So the field crews have to walk the entire route, and when they come to these situations, they'll do soil tests, they make lists of species, and then they'll use GPS to actually walk and map the wetlands once they've completed that work.
Did you also consult with different agencies to see what had already been delineated?
So a lot of the CRP and other types of land, we met with the NRCS and FSA, I think it was 2 years ago, because we go through 5 states, and the information on any easements or landowner agreed upon protected wetlands is privileged. We can't get that information. So we had a call with Washington, D.C., with the director of the program. He then convened a call with all 5 states. So we had like 30 people on the call. They picked a point of contact. So we started sending FOIA requests. We would send them the KMZs of the route, and they would pull their records, see what was there, be it a lien or ownership or any kind of easement. But unfortunately, what they sent us was a name in section township range, which was totally useless to me. So I turned it over to the land department, and then Micah would use that information. In his team, when they talked to the landowners, they'd ask them, "Are you in CRP? Are you in this? Are you in that?" So it was kind of an iterative process, and we're still doing those FOIA requests. As the route changes, we send it to them. We're waiting on the next delivery. It's coming this month.
So did FSA or NRCS provide any more specific locations than the name township?
No, it's protected.
As you did the field survey and discovered wetlands in various locations, was that identification then, did Summit inform the landowner?
I'm not sure what was provided to the landowner after surveys.
So once you've located the wetlands, you just told Summit then?
Yeah, we write the reports and we submit them to the Corps, and they in turn consult with the other agencies.
And you don't know whether Summit informed the landowner or not?
I do not know.
Do you know approximately how many parcels along the route are impacted by wetlands?
No, there's only, as you can see by the acreage, when we had it up there, it's less than 1% of the route has wetlands in it, so it's pretty small.
But can wetlands be of any size, though?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
On page 24 and 25 of the hearing exhibit 5 here, I'm just going to do you talked a little bit with Mr. Meyer, I believe, about seed mixes. I just have a follow-up question to that. Do you know what precautions Summit is going to be taking to prevent weed seed contamination of the seed mixes?
So I think either in the weed plan or in the AMIP, one of the documents, it says they'll get weed-free sources for both the seed mix and any mulch that's used, hay or any kind of mulch in that matter. And then they've also committed to monitoring to make sure that nothing is introduced based on their construction activity. Has
Summit, so switching back to wetlands, and let's go to IFBF hearing exhibit 3. We'll switch documents here. Okay. So, as you identified, you did ask FSA for locations of wetlands, and because they're protected.
Right.
But did Summit request any farmland owners to file an AD 26?
That I wouldn't know.
Let me correct that. AD 1026. I said that wrong.
Right. Yeah, I think I would assume in the negotiations between the land department and the landowner, these things would come up so that it could be addressed and properly, and then the information could be exchanged.
But you're not aware if that occurred or not?
I wouldn't be involved in that, yeah.
Okay. On page 3, paragraph E, I was directed that you might perhaps know the answer to my questions here on this page, so we'll see. Since with your involvement with the environmental aspects of it, I'll give you a minute there to read paragraph E.
Yeah, I believe Micah testified. I know he wrote this paragraph, so he would be the one who would take care of that.
Okay. I believe he asked me to talk to you.
Oh, he did? Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's okay.
Well, I have nothing to do with compensation or,
Okay.
we would provide the shape files of the wetland. They would decide the construction methodology with the landowner and the NRCS or FSA, depending on who is overseeing that property, and then decide on whether or not they'd have to be paid for because of the impacts or not, or whether we bore it. We may change the construction method based on what's there.
If the pipeline construction or land restoration drains a wetland, if necessary, is Summit going to be working with you to help restore that wetland?
I don't know if
Or
I'll
with
be
your
around.
company?
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be around, but Summit would be responsible, yes.
Okay. Moving to your direct testimony on page 5. In line 16. So you're asked a question about effects on anticipated on surrounding land, and then so I'll give you a minute to read the first few lines of your answer there. So when you state that none of these impacts will be significant or long term, are you referencing the previous sentence where you talk about noise, dust, additional traffic?
Correct.
And you're not talking about other impacts?
No.
Okay. Thank you. And then on page 6, starting on line 7, and you make a similar statement. I'll let you go ahead and give you a minute to look at that before I ask my question.
Okay.
So where you state there will be no long-term impacts to the use of land for agricultural purposes, are you only referencing the use of the land for agriculture, or are you trying to make a representation about the productivity of that ag land?
Just the use.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Eisenhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Schmidt. I work in the General Assembly for the last 15 years. Have served on Environmental Protection, Natural Resources Committee, so hopefully I can ask a couple of intelligent questions on those topics. Earlier in the proceeding, Summit testified about how the overall project is kind of divided up into 3 parts. You have separate entities dealing with capture, one transportation or the pipeline, and a third being the sequestration site. Did your work involve all three or just the pipeline?
The pipeline.
Thank you. I want to refer to your direct testimony, and it could be brought up if they'd like, on page, looks like it's 10, line 10, talked about impacts and mitigation measures, refers to sensitive, threatened, endangered species. Mr. Taylor, you extensively used the word protected species, and I think EPA refers to those in their various, not EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service. Is the word protected left out there intentionally, or is that part of what you would call sensitive species?
I mean, we typically use these categories to cover state and federal. So protected, I've not usually used that term.
But you didn't mean to exclude any species with that language. Thank you. Is it in general true that federal regulations related to threatened endangered species focus on the birds or the animals and not necessarily the habitat, protecting the actual species?
Well, their law is written specific to the species, but their review includes the habitat. So they require us to look for their habitat, characterize the quality of it, because some species you're not going to find. Like, you could go out today and not see a Dakota skipper, but you can come back next year and find it if the habitat's suitable.
But if the species isn't there, there are not necessarily protections for the habitat if it's not there.
Unless it's critical habitat, no.
Okay. A little farther up the line 9, page 9, line 17, expected impacts and mitigation measures. You talk about, on line 21, consequently, the effects of long-term habitat loss on native wildlife populations will be minor. Did you also look at migrating bird populations or just native bird populations?
Listed species, be they state or federal.
So that would include migrating birds, and not just native. Correct. To Iowa. Yeah. So you mentioned you did some work for the Audubon Society. As it so happens, I was just joining the board for that group in Iowa County. So we've had some situations there related to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which basically makes it illegal to take migratory birds. And as a practical matter, that means can't interrupt their breeding during nesting season. So have you recommended to Summit that they avoid construction on grasslands, for example, that have nesting species? Or would you recommend they get a license to take those species?
So you can't get a license to take the species. Only researchers can do that.
Okay.
So we identified the habitat for certain migratory birds, or what the Fish and Wildlife had us look for as far as which species to survey for. So the statements in reference to the fact there's very little of that native habitat. And so as far as a window of time, we haven't gotten that window of time from the service yet. But if they tell us that's the window we have to meet, that would be the window we meet.
So we talked earlier about emergent situations. If a construction crew is starting to go through an alfalfa field, sees bobolinks flying around, would that precipitate a halt on that until they're through nesting?
My understanding from the Fish and Wildlife Service is that it's a discretionary enforcement on their part. And I'll leave that term out there. I don't know what that means.
So they will decide whether or not to punish you if you do. My question is, have you recommended to Summit that they avoid construction where migratory birds have been found in the moment?
Not all species of migratory birds.
So
the Fish and Wildlife Service identifies a class of migratory birds that are worth protection. We don't protect like robins and sparrows. You can drive your truck down the road and violate the Migratory Bird Act when you get a bird in your radiator.
That's why I use bobolinks as an example. They're pretty clearly are protected. But I'm asking about the mitigation measure. Have you recommended that they avoid construction where migratory birds' nests have been found as construction is proceeding?
So, as I indicated, we did the surveys. We provide the information to the service. They'll tell us what the conservation measures are.
So you're not responsible for recommending mitigation measures to Summit, the Fish and Wildlife Services?
Well, it's their jurisdiction. So we can make recommendations, but at the end of the day, they're the ones that will decide what happens.
They will decide to make you do more than you recommended, probably not less. That's my testimony. One other general question. You said you were responsible for helping prepare Exhibit F, correct?
Yes.
In that, it says one of the one of the aspects of public convenience and necessity promoted by the project is reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the effort to combat climate change. Did you do any research around this or make any analysis to support that assertion?
If that was in Section 1, I didn't write that.
I'm not sure what section, but you did not do any research on, emissions and...
I didn't, but I don't know if Summit did.
Okay.
I can't answer that.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Jorde. One. We were going to take a break at 2:45, but if we can get you, I don't know if you need. I don't want to put it.
No, I'll be done by then.
Okay, just go ahead.
All right, sir. Yeah, I haven't seen you in a while from the Keystone days in Nebraska. Good to see you again. You were answering some questions with Mr. Taylor, and you used qualifiers relative to surveys of where we had access. You recollect that?
Correct.
And obviously, if you didn't have access for whatever reason, you couldn't have on the ground and highly reliable data. Is that fair?
Correct.
It's true. Well, is it true that no geohazard phase 2 surveys have been commenced at this time?
That wasn't under my scope. That would have been Eric under engineering.
Okay, so nothing.
I have no idea.
Okay. In terms of what you and your firm were asked to do, was it limited to the actual locating of and the potential routing and then construction of the linear infrastructure, or is your firm also tasked with looking at environmental effects of the capture facilities and the construction of those facilities?
There were other firms working on the capture facility side because it's a different regulatory process. They were already underway when my firm got hired, so they continued to do that work independent.
Okay, so to be clear, you don't have any testimony relative to adverse environmental effects relative to any construction of capture facilities?
Yeah, that's most of the state regulatory processes don't include capture facilities except Minnesota, and there's a firm that's doing all that work separate from everybody else. So they're doing the air permitting, the water permitting. I have nothing to do with that.
Do you know the name of that firm?
I believe it's Mergent.
Mergent? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And so in terms of the environmental effects and other effects of the hundreds of millions of gallons of water that Summit proposes to use to cool the CO2 at each of the capture facilities, have you or your firm been tasked to look into the environmental effects of that?
No.
And then what about the use of triethylene glycol, the chemical to infuse into the capture facilities to try to remove water before the stream gets into the pipeline? Has your company been involved in the environmental effects of that?
As I indicated, we're not working on the capture facilities.
And not even the effects of the capture facilities, nothing about it?
We're not working on them. think that's all. Thank you, sir.
Okay, before we go to board question. Was it? I don't care. Just want to double check with the parties before we go to the board for questions. Board Member Burns.
Thank you. All right. On page 6 of your direct testimony, you discussed the crossings of public land. This kind of goes, it's going to piggyback a little bit on what Representative Eisenhardt said. Can you describe the difference between an Exhibit F and your testimony?
Exhibit F is part of the petition. So it just is a high-level summary of the environmental impacts. My testimony was, I don't believe it was updated when we updated Exhibit F. So it would have been out of sync as far as the numbers.
So has Summit received all the necessary permits for crossing public lands?
No, we filed with IDNR, but we haven't received them.
And in your Exhibit F, or in the Exhibit F, it stated that there was 0.18 miles, but your testimony said 0.07 miles.
Yeah, there's probably going to be a disconnect because the testimony wasn't updated when we updated Exhibit F. So.
All right, thank you. And then in your testimony, you discussed Lidka Creek. Exhibit F does not mention this area. Is that the same?
I think it's in the table in Exhibit F, if I remember correctly. I'd have to look at it to see, but I think it's in that one table that lists all the public lands.
Okay. And we'll check on that.
Okay.
On page 6 of your direct testimony, also you discussed tree removal. You stated that trees will be removed, but trees will be kept clear for 15 feet on either side of the pipeline. For clarification, Summit Carbon will allow trees within 15 feet of either side of the pipeline and not require the entire 50-foot permanent easement to be kept clear of trees. Is that correct?
Typically, that's what's done, yes. You just have to see it from the air. So 30 feet is about as narrow as you can get. See it from the air.
So it's for the flyover inspections.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And on page 14 of your direct testimony, you discussed lit reviews. Could you please explain why a literature review, or what it is, and how it relates to Summit Carbon's pipeline?
So when you do cultural resource investigations, the first step is you have to go into the SHPO records and look at previous studies. So it's considered a literature review. You also look at whatever scientific literature is available on encampments and historic use of the area. That gives you the context to design your field surveys and know where potentially sites are found. So you do the literature review first, and then you go out on the ground and you execute the surveys.
Actually, my last couple questions here for you. The board asked Mr. Skovanec about proposals by landowners of crossing federal lands instead of their property. And so what is the permitting process for crossing federal lands? And is Summit crossing federal lands at all in Iowa?
We're not crossing federal lands in Iowa. The process depends on the federal agency that manages the land. So a national park, they don't have authority from Congress to issue a right-of-way. So we can't cross them, period. We talked about easements with Farm Service Agency or U.S. Fish and Wildlife with a wetland easement. Those you can cross, but they require certain hurdles you have to go through. Because once the government spends the money on something, you have to prove you're not going to impede that money that they spent.
So as we had different landowners up here, and if they had suggested a reroute that would have included a reroute through federal land, it's kind of a non-starter.
You know, particularly ones that don't have the authority to issue